Two tanks came to define the terror and the hope of the Second World War not by what they were on paper, but by what men lived through inside them. On one side stood the German Tiger, heavy, angular, almost mythic, its 88mm gun able to tear open Allied armor at ranges where the enemy could barely see it. On the other side rolled the American Sherman, smaller, simpler, built in numbers that turned ports and railheads into seas of steel. For some, the Tiger was the hunter and the Sherman the hunted. For others, the Tiger was an expensive monument to a losing gamble, while the Sherman became the steady, unglamorous workhorse that helped win a brutal, grinding war. Ask the veterans who survived those battles and they rarely talk first about armor thickness or muzzle velocity. They talk about engines that started on cold mornings, about tracks thrown in the mud, about shells that bounced, about friends who did not make it out of a burning hull. They remember the feeling in their stomachs when someone whispered, "There's a Tiger out there," and the strange comfort of a Sherman that, even damaged, could be dragged back, repaired, and sent out again. This is not just a story of which tank was better. It is a story about what better truly means in war, about fear and resilience, about genius and mistake, about machines designed by strangers but trusted with the lives of young men. The comparison between the German Tiger tank and the American M4 Sherman is rooted not only in the mechanical and tactical characteristics of these machines, but also in the human experiences of the soldiers who fought in and against them, the strategic doctrines that shaped their existence, and the industrial philosophies that defined how each nation approached the problem of armored warfare in the Second World War. Any attempt to determine which of these vehicles was better must therefore go beyond the limited view of battlefield performance alone and consider the wider context, including logistics, crew survivability, industrial sustainability, tactical doctrines, psychological impact, and the long-term legacy of both machines. The Tiger and the Sherman became symbols of very different visions of war, and the men who served inside them bore the consequences of those visions with courage, sacrifice, and determination, often under conditions of immeasurable stress and danger. In approaching this topic, it is essential to maintain the highest respect for those who lived through the events described, whether they fought in German or Allied service, or whether they were civilians caught in the vast machinery of global conflict. Their experiences demand sober accuracy, humility, and a commitment to truth. The Tiger I, officially designated Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger Ausf. E, was introduced by Nazi Germany in 1942 as a direct response to battlefield encounters that had exposed limitations in earlier German tank designs. Particularly, the appearance of the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 during the invasion of the Soviet Union demonstrated that German armor would need to evolve quickly to regain the tactical initiative. German engineers, following an established tradition of mechanical sophistication and an emphasis on tactical superiority, produced a tank that represented a significant escalation in armor protection, firepower, and battlefield presence. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun, based on the highly successful Flak-36 anti-aircraft and anti-tank platform, offered exceptional penetration capability and accuracy at long range, making the Tiger a formidable threat to Allied armor. Its frontal armor, thick and largely immune to the standard tank guns of its opponents at typical combat distances, inspired fear among Allied crews and forced significant tactical adjustments. The M4 Sherman, by contrast, was not conceived as a response to enemy super-heavy designs, but as the next logical step in an expanding series of American armored vehicles that prioritized mechanical reliability, standardization, ease of maintenance, and mass production. Adopted in 1942 and fielded in large numbers, the Sherman was initially armed with a 75mm gun adequate for infantry support and capable of defeating most Axis armor at the time of its introduction. Its design emphasized logistical sustainability, ease of training, and the ability to be transported across oceans, repaired in the field, and modified rapidly according to changing tactical needs. For American and Allied planners, the primary purpose of armored forces was not individual battlefield duels against enemy heavy tanks, but rather combined arms maneuver, operational exploitation, and the reliable support of infantry in rapidly advancing campaigns. The Sherman embodied the American industrial philosophy of the war: build enough reliable vehicles to ensure constant pressure and material superiority, rather than seek perfection in engineering complexity. At first glance, the comparison between the Tiger and the Sherman might suggest a clear tactical imbalance, with the Tiger superior in armor and armament, and the Sherman inferior in both respects. Yet battlefield conditions were far more complex. The Tiger's heavy armor and powerful gun gave it an undeniable edge in isolated, open-terrain engagements, particularly in environments where long-range gunnery would determine outcomes. However, this advantage existed within a much broader operational reality that often limited the Tiger's ability to exert maximum effect. Its weight, mechanical complexity, limited numbers, and high maintenance demands meant that it could not always be positioned where it was needed most, nor could it be produced in sufficient quantities to offset attrition. It required substantial fuel supplies, extensive mechanical support, frequent spare parts, and highly trained crews to operate effectively. These factors imposed strategic burdens that grew heavier as the war progressed, particularly as Allied bombing and naval blockades disrupted German industrial capacity and resource lines. For Allied soldiers facing the Tiger for the first time, particularly in North Africa, Italy, and later in Northwest Europe, the encounter could be overwhelming. Many veterans recalled their shock upon realizing that their standard tank rounds bounced harmlessly off the Tiger's thick frontal armor. Crews described the sound of impact, the sparks thrown from impacts, and the helplessness felt as the Tiger's gun traversed toward them while they searched desperately for cover or maneuvered to hit its weaker side or rear armor. Such experiences were not inventions of post-war myth but genuine reflections of the battlefield imbalance at the point of contact. The Tiger could destroy Shermans at long distances where return fire was ineffective, and in static defensive positions, it could dominate sectors of terrain far beyond what its numbers might suggest. Yet even in these moments, the broader context of armored warfare was decisive. The United States and its allies were not reliant solely on Sherman tanks to counter the Tiger. They employed air power, artillery, tank destroyers, and combined arms coordination to mitigate the Tiger's advantages. American commanders emphasized mobility, communication, and overwhelming force concentration, ensuring that when Tigers were isolated, damaged, or immobilized, they could be destroyed by methods other than direct tank-to-tank duels. In many cases, the Tiger's mechanical reliability proved more dangerous to its own crews than enemy fire. Veterans of both sides recalled long, arduous maintenance efforts, frequent breakdowns, and situations where Tigers were destroyed or abandoned due to lack of fuel or spare parts rather than enemy action. These experiences reinforce the essential truth that battlefield superiority cannot be measured solely in millimeters of armor or in the muzzle velocity of a gun. In contrast, Sherman crews often valued their vehicles for reasons not immediately visible in technical statistics. The Sherman offered exceptional reliability under harsh conditions, from desert sand to winter mud. Its engine systems, transmission design, and component standardization meant that damaged or worn parts could be replaced rapidly, sometimes within hours. Training new crews was efficient, and battlefield repairs were common even after severe damage. For the men whose lives depended on their machines, this reliability was more than a mechanical trait, it was a source of confidence and psychological resilience. Knowing that their tank would start, steer, and function consistently allowed Sherman crews to focus on tactics, coordination, and the support of infantry rather than the constant fear of breakdown. When considering the overall question of which tank was better, this human dimension must be recognized as a critical factor. From an operational standpoint, the Sherman also benefited from its adaptability. Throughout the war, it was upgraded with improved armor layouts, better guns, and refinements in protection, including the later introduction of the 76mm gun, high-velocity ammunition, and even specialized variants such as mine-clearing tanks, flamethrower tanks, amphibious versions, and recovery vehicles. These modifications allowed the Sherman to remain tactically viable into the final phases of the war, even as German designs grew heavier. The Tiger, while formidable, lacked this same degree of transformation, in part because each Tiger was a structurally complex and resource-intensive vehicle, limiting the potential for mass-scale modification or diversification. Despite its strengths, however, the Sherman presented certain dangers to its crews. Early models, with gasoline engines and ammunition stored without wet rack protection, were prone to internal fires when penetrated. This vulnerability led to the tragic perception among crews that the Sherman would ignite easily, earning grim nicknames that reflected the fears and experiences of the men inside them. Many Allied veterans spoke of losing friends in these incidents, and historians must treat these memories with the utmost seriousness. Later improvements reduced this risk significantly, and statistical analysis conducted after the war demonstrated that the Sherman was no more prone to fire than other tanks of its era once upgrades were implemented. Nonetheless, the early experiences left enduring emotional scars, and these must be acknowledged honestly. Conversely, the Tiger's psychological presence was enormous. Even when few Tigers were present, Allied troops often believed many more were in the field. Reports from the front frequently exaggerated their numbers, and soldiers recounted the anxiety and caution that accompanied any suspected sighting of a Tiger. The impact of this fear, while difficult to quantify, cannot be dismissed. In warfare, morale and perception influence behavior as much as machine specifications. German commanders understood this effect and deployed Tigers in ways that maximized their psychological weight, often placing them in critical defensive positions where their long-range firepower could disrupt Allied operations disproportionately to their limited availability. When considering the strategic value of each vehicle, production numbers are instructive. Approximately 1,350 Tiger I tanks were manufactured, along with several hundred Tiger II tanks. Meanwhile, over 49,000 Sherman tanks were produced in total, including all variants. This disparity reflects fundamentally different strategic priorities. Germany sought to regain tactical supremacy through engineering excellence in individual machines. The United States sought to overwhelm the battlefield through industrial capacity and logistical superiority. In the broader context of total war, the ability to produce and supply large quantities of reliable equipment proved decisive. The Tiger could dominate individual engagements, but the Sherman could sustain entire campaigns. Moreover, the Sherman's effectiveness must be viewed in relation to the combined arms strategy adopted by the Allied forces. The tank was never intended to fight unsupported against the heaviest German armor in head-on engagements. Instead, Shermans typically operated alongside infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support. This integrated doctrine allowed the Allies to maintain momentum, exploit breakthroughs, and sustain pressure across multiple fronts. Air superiority, in particular, played a significant role. As the war progressed, German armored units, including Tigers, faced increasing vulnerability to air attack. Veteran crews recalled the dread they felt when they lacked effective air cover. Allied fighter bombers, though not always accurate, contributed to a constant sense of exposure and uncertainty among German crews, affecting their ability to maneuver and resupply. The human factor remained central to any fair assessment. The men who crewed these tanks, whether in German or Allied service, endured intense physical and psychological strain. Tank combat involved confined spaces, extreme heat, deafening noise, and the constant possibility of sudden, catastrophic violence. Crews depended on one another not only for survival, but for emotional support during moments of overwhelming fear and fatigue. Veterans from both sides described the claustrophobia of the turret, the smell of fuel, oil, and cordite, and the weight of responsibility that came from operating a machine whose failure could mean death. Their courage, resilience, and professionalism demand deep respect, regardless of nationality or ideology. For German crews, operating the Tiger could be a source of pride, reflecting a belief in the technological superiority of their vehicle. Yet this pride coexisted with the enormous burden of maintaining such a complex machine under increasingly desperate logistical conditions. Many crews reported spending more time performing maintenance than fighting. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and lack of spare parts limited their mobility and operational readiness. As the war continued, retreating under pressure, abandoning damaged Tigers became increasingly common, and these losses were emotionally devastating for crews who regarded their machines almost as living companions forged in combat. For American crews, the Sherman's dependability offered reassurance, but the knowledge of facing better armored and better armed opponents could produce profound anxiety. Veterans recalled the shock of encountering Tigers and Panthers for the first time, realizing that tactical discipline and teamwork were essential for survival. Success depended upon coordination, maneuver, and numerical advantage rather than technical superiority. These realities shaped the mindset of Sherman crews and reinforced the importance of training, communication, and mutual trust. When evaluating the Tiger and the Sherman as fighting vehicles, it is essential to consider survivability, not merely in terms of armor thickness, but also in terms of crew survival rates and the likelihood of being able to continue fighting after taking damage. The Sherman's combination of reliability, ease of repair, and logistical support systems greatly increased the probability that damaged vehicles could be returned to service. Crews often survived penetrations due to internal safety improvements implemented over time. The Tiger, by contrast, often became immobile due to mechanical failure or logistical shortages, leaving crews vulnerable. The consequences of immobility were severe. An immobilized tank could not defend itself, escape danger, or avoid encirclement. Thus, the Tiger's battlefield invincibility was frequently limited by external realities that had nothing to do with armor or gun performance. In addition, the Tiger's combat performance must be viewed through the lens of opportunity cost. Every Tiger required enormous industrial resources, skilled labor, time, and fuel. These resources could have produced several medium tanks, or other essential equipment such as aircraft or artillery pieces. From a strategic perspective, the German decision to prioritize heavy tanks represented a gamble that tactical superiority could compensate for numerical inferiority. Ultimately, the war demonstrated that such a gamble could not be sustained under conditions of industrial attrition and strategic overextension. As Allied ground forces increased their pressure across multiple fronts in 1943 and 1944, the contrast between the Tiger and the Sherman became more defined not simply by battlefield encounters, but through the cumulative pressures of an expanding and intensifying war. The Tiger's battlefield reputation continued to grow, fed by real experiences and genuine tactical dominance when circumstances favored it, yet the operational environment increasingly exposed the strategic imbalance between a weapon built for excellence and a war that demanded endurance. The Sherman, meanwhile, evolved from a tank that was initially adequate into a platform whose entire value lay in its ability to endure the constant friction of sustained combat operations. In the North African Campaign, where some of the earliest confrontations between Tigers and Shermans occurred, conditions highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of both vehicles. The wide, open terrain allowed the Tiger's superior range and accuracy to be exploited effectively. German crews learned to engage from distances that minimized the threat posed by Allied guns, and Tiger units gained valuable combat experience that shaped later tactics. Yet the climate also punished mechanical complexity. The fine tolerances that made the Tiger an engineering marvel at home became a liability in desert heat and dust. Tracks wore rapidly, transmissions overheated, and crews faced the constant task of keeping sand out of critical components. By contrast, the Sherman's relatively simple and robust automotive systems proved more tolerant of harsh desert conditions. Maintenance teams could restore mobility quickly, sometimes turning a disabled vehicle into a combat-ready machine within a day. When the Italian campaign began, the terrain shifted from deserts and open plains to mountains, narrow roads, and fortified defensive lines. The Tiger's power remained formidable, but the ability to maneuver became increasingly constrained. Moving and supplying heavy tanks through mountain passes, over bomb-damaged bridges, and along precarious roadways demanded significant engineering effort. A single destroyed bridge could delay a Tiger unit for days. Sherman-equipped formations faced similar terrain challenges, but their lighter weight and mechanical reliability allowed them to keep pace with infantry operations more consistently. The ability to advance, consolidate, and attack repeatedly became crucial in a campaign defined by attrition across rugged landscapes. This operational contrast deepened further as the war progressed into northwestern Europe. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the Tiger's range advantage was diminished by restricted lines of sight. Sherman units, meanwhile, encountered heavy resistance and suffered significant casualties, particularly during the first phase of the Normandy campaign. Allied reports from the period show the profound shock experienced by frontline Sherman crews when they encountered prepared German armored divisions. Many remembered seeing their first Tiger not as a machine at long range, but as a sudden presence dominating a crossroads, a field, or a small ridgeline. The trauma of those encounters shaped their view of the enemy and contributed to both caution and determination in equal measure. To meet the challenge, the Allies adapted. New tactics emphasized coordinated fire and maneuver, the use of smoke, and the concentration of multiple tanks against a single enemy vehicle. The psychological burden remained significant, however. Sherman crews often described the tension of scanning terrain for threats that, if encountered on the wrong terms, could destroy them before they could retaliate effectively. German Tiger crews, in turn, described the unique pressure of being outnumbered, increasingly lacking air cover, and forced to operate under conditions where every mechanical failure could be fatal, not only to the machine, but to the men inside. During this period, the industrial dichotomy between the two vehicles became fully evident. German factories struggled to keep pace with attrition, while Allied production surged. The Sherman became not only common, but ubiquitous. Numerous variants began to populate the battlefield, each tailored to specific tactical needs. Specialized engineering vehicles, command tanks, recovery variants, and upgraded combat models expanded the Sherman's tactical utility. This flexibility extended far beyond the initial design intention, and it reflected the degree to which Allied operational planners relied upon the Sherman as a modular solution to shifting demands. Meanwhile, Tiger units took pride in the quality of their machines and the skill required to master them. German crew training emphasized precise gunnery, careful positioning, and efficient cooperation inside the tank. Many Tiger veterans recalled the bond formed within the confined spaces of the turret, strengthened by shared challenges and mutual dependence. Yet they also carried the awareness that their machines were irreplaceable assets. Every engagement that risked a Tiger was a calculated decision. Every mechanical failure was a potential operational crisis. Every loss was deeply felt, not only tactically, but emotionally. The Tiger was a symbol of German armored prowess, but also a reminder of the shrinking margin for error as the strategic situation deteriorated. At the same time, Allied crews experienced a different emotional arc. With each repaired Sherman rolled back into action, with each replacement tank delivered to a frontline unit, the realization grew that the momentum of the war was shifting in their favor. Though losses could be painful and sudden, the persistent ability to return to combat gave many Sherman crews a sense of continuity and resilience that shaped morale in profound ways. Their confidence grew not from technical superiority, but from the belief that they would not be left without support, that their machines could be replaced, and that their sacrifices contributed directly to the steady advance. These parallel emotional experiences, German pride tempered by growing scarcity, Allied determination reinforced by logistical consistency, formed a crucial psychological dimension to the comparison between the Tiger and the Sherman. It was not simply a matter of armor and armament, but of faith, fear, endurance, and expectation. Thus, by late 1944, the Tiger's battlefield dominance, though still real in certain contexts, increasingly stood against a tide of logistical exhaustion. The Sherman, though technically inferior in a direct one-versus-one confrontation, had become inseparable from the Allied operational engine driving the war toward its final chapters. And in this widening gap between tactical power and strategic endurance lay the decisive contrast between the two machines. As the war entered its later stages, the operational environment shifted further against the German heavy tank strategy. Allied forces expanded their logistical networks, improved their coordination, and refined their ability to deploy overwhelming firepower at decisive moments. The Tiger, although still respected and feared, could no longer dictate the terms of engagement as consistently as it once had. Increasingly, Tiger crews found themselves forced into defensive battles of attrition, rather than the offensive maneuvers that had defined German armored doctrine earlier in the war. In these conditions, the Tiger's strengths, particularly its long-range gunnery and thick frontal armor, were less decisive, while its weaknesses in mobility, maintenance, and fuel dependence became more critical. Throughout 1944 and 1945, logistical collapse impacted German armored units severely. Rail transport disruptions, fuel shortages, and the loss of experienced mechanics made it more difficult to deploy Tigers in sufficient numbers or maintain them effectively. Units that once fielded full complements of operational heavy tanks were reduced to only a few machines, often immobilized or in need of repairs. Veterans from these units later recalled the frustration of preparing vehicles meticulously for action, only to be unable to participate because of a lack of fuel or spare parts. Such accounts underscore the reality that battlefield outcomes depended not only on machine versus machine encounters, but also on the broader context of industrial resilience, strategic planning, and logistical endurance. The Sherman, by contrast, benefited from steadily improving supply lines, standardized manufacturing processes, and a continual flow of replacement vehicles. Units could be reinforced quickly, losses replenished, and upgrades implemented over time. Crew training programs ensured that replacements could be integrated smoothly into existing formations. This continuity gave Allied forces a strategic stability that proved indispensable. While individual Shermans could be destroyed in combat, and many were, the larger system supporting them ensured that armored capability was preserved at the operational level. This resilience helped sustain the Allied advance across Europe, despite intense resistance and considerable sacrifice. It is important, in any balanced assessment, to acknowledge the heavy price paid by Sherman crews, especially during periods of rapid, aggressive operations when they encountered defensive positions held by veteran German forces equipped with Tigers, Panthers, and anti-tank guns. Many American and Allied crews were killed or wounded in these battles, and their loss was felt deeply by their comrades. Veterans spoke of the emotional toll of seeing multiple tanks in a platoon or company destroyed in a single engagement, of losing friends whose absence could never be filled, and of carrying these memories long after the war ended. These were not abstract losses measured in numbers, but personal tragedies remembered for a lifetime. At the same time, German Tiger crews also faced enormous dangers, especially as Allied forces increased their pressure and air superiority became more pronounced. Many Tiger crews were lost in circumstances beyond their control, including airstrikes, artillery barrages, and situations in which mechanical breakdown left the crew stranded under fire. Survivors spoke of the sudden violence that could engulf a tank when penetrated, the chaos inside the turret, and the desperate attempts to escape burning machines. Their sacrifices, too, must be recognized with solemn respect. Regardless of the uniforms they wore, the men inside these tanks endured shared hardships, faced similar fears, and demonstrated extraordinary bravery. When evaluating the Tiger and the Sherman, it is essential to consider not only how each performed in combat but what each represented within the broader trajectory of the war. The Tiger embodied a belief in tactical overmatch through engineering excellence, an approach that prioritized superior firepower and armor at the individual vehicle level. Its design reflected the strategic environment Germany sought to maintain: decisive offensives, rapid breakthroughs, and battlefield campaigns controlled through armored dominance. Yet as that environment changed, the Tiger's advantages could not compensate for Germany's weakening industrial and logistical position. The Sherman, by contrast, represented a different strategic vision, one rooted in the realities of a long, multi-theater war demanding flexible strategy, sustained production, and combined arms coordination. Its strengths lay not only in what it could do on the battlefield, but in the system behind it: the factories, the engineers, the logistics officers, the mechanics, the drivers, the ship crews transporting tanks across oceans, and the infantry and artillery units fighting alongside them. In this sense, the Sherman was more than a machine. It was a symbol of the Allied capacity to sustain a global war effort, adapt to changing conditions, and support the soldiers who bore the burden of combat. Although the Tiger possessed superior armor and firepower in technical terms, the Sherman's reliability, adaptability, and sheer availability made it decisive in the broader conflict. This does not diminish the Tiger's battlefield achievements or the skill and courage of the men who operated it. Rather, it underscores the reality that wars are not decided solely by the best machine, but by the system capable of employing its machines most effectively. Ultimately, comparisons between the Tiger and the Sherman must grapple with a deeper truth: these tanks were weapons in a conflict whose human cost was immeasurable. The victories and losses experienced by their crews were marked by courage, fear, sacrifice, and a profound sense of duty. Tens of thousands of men served in these machines, and many did not return home. Their experiences were shaped not only by the metal that surrounded them, but by the comradeship that sustained them, the leadership that guided them, and the ideals or obligations that compelled them into combat. After the war, surviving veterans reflected on their experiences with a sense of solemnity. Many expressed deep respect for the soldiers they had fought against and for the hardships endured by both sides. For Sherman veterans, remembering the moments when their tanks met Tigers brought back intense memories of danger, loss, and resilience. For Tiger veterans, recalling the challenges of maintaining their complex machines and the moment-to-moment uncertainty of late-war combat invoked a mixture of pride, sorrow, and reflection. Historical analysis has continued to evolve, drawing on archival research, battlefield studies, and the testimonies of those who lived through the war. Over time, the simplistic narratives that emerged immediately after the conflict, whether glorifying German engineering or dismissing Allied armor, have been replaced by more nuanced understandings. Scholars now examine the Tiger and the Sherman not simply as opposing machines, but as expressions of two profoundly different approaches to the mobilization of industrial societies for total war. The Tiger excelled in tactical duels, dominating the battlefield when conditions allowed it to exploit its strengths. Its engineering was remarkable, and its combat performance exceptional under favorable circumstances. But its limitations were real, rooted in its complexity, its resource demands, and the strategic context in which it was fielded. The Sherman excelled in endurance. It was a platform that could be maintained, rebuilt, transported, upgraded, and multiplied in a way no German heavy tank could match. Its value cannot be understood solely by comparing armor thickness or gun caliber, but by recognizing what it enabled: sustained operations, consistent support for infantry, and the strategic momentum required to win a global conflict. In the end, assessing which tank was better depends on the criteria we choose. If the measure is individual battlefield duels under ideal conditions, the Tiger holds a clear advantage. If the measure is the ability to shape the outcome of a long, industrial war fought across continents, then the Sherman must be understood as the more decisive machine. Yet the most important measure transcends technical evaluation. The legacy of both tanks lies in the memories of the men who fought in them, the sacrifices they made, and the lessons they carried home. Those lessons endure. They teach that engineering brilliance is admirable, but insufficient without sustainable supply. That courage is indispensable, but most powerful when supported by preparation, logistics, and unity. That machines, no matter how advanced, remain tools in the hands of human beings who bear the true burden of war. As we reflect upon the Tiger and the Sherman today, we must do so with humility, with gratitude, and with respect. Gratitude to the veterans who endured unimaginable hardship. Respect for those who never returned. Humility before the scale of human suffering that defined the conflict. And above all, a commitment to remembrance. Because the true measure of their legacy is not which machine was superior in technical terms, but what their experiences can teach us about the cost of war and the value of peace. Their memories deserve nothing less.